I'm Rachael Maves, and you're listening to the Getting Naked with Leaders in Education podcast, where we strip away the layers and get to the raw, unfiltered stories behind the leaders shaping the future of education. My guest today is Babatunde Ilori, Chief Executive Officer of Parsec Education. Founded in 2023, Parsec Education's mission is to improve and transform K-12 education and student outcomes through modernizing, evaluating, improving, and standardizing the ways schools view, interpret, and respond to data. Prior to Parsec Education, Babatunde served as Executive Director of Accountability and Communications and Director of Performance Management and Internal Communications for Madera Unified School District, and Director of Equality and Chief of Staff for Fresno Unified School District. Babatunde, thank you for joining me on the Getting Naked with Educational Leaders podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Rachel.
Babatunde, we have to start with this name. We have to start with this name today. I know internally we wrestled and went back and forth. Do we name it Getting Naked? Do we name it Getting Real? We threw around all these names and finally landed on Getting Naked, but you need to unpack that and give us the why behind it.
Yeah, so I would say that it kind of started off for me when I read a book titled Getting Naked by a guy named Patrick Lencioni. He writes a lot of business fables, and he has an organization called the Table Group, and I'm a big fan of his. But anyways, I read this book and I was pretty transformed by his message, which was ultimately, it's not literally like getting naked, right? Obviously, right? It's an analogy, but the whole idea is like being like radically honest, right? And transparent and vulnerable and having humility, right? And having a sense of selflessness. I mean, I think like these are the types of things that we all should be doing because it's just good things to do as being a good human being on this earth. But when we're talking about education, especially like when we're talking about trying to radically transform education here in the United States, and particularly for students in the margins, right? Students of color, African American students, emergent multilingual students, or what we call English learner students in the state. We need to be honest, and it starts off with this idea of getting naked, like being radically transparent. And I think that we don't do that enough. I feel like in education, we don't share what the elephant in the room is. And I'll just give you an example of this, Rachel. I coach soccer. I love soccer. I'm a big fan. Two of my three kids play. I coaching both their teams right now, and I get to play a lot. And one of the things that happen when I play with like my friends that are like a little bit like closer to my age or some young adults is, you get into it, you say certain things, you joke around, and you're just playing. And then one time recently when we were playing, a person used the N-word. And what happened, which was an interesting moment for me, was that they didn't say it to me. Obviously, I'm Black. It wasn't like, hey, the N-word to me. It was to a colleague on his team in a weird way. It was just like, hey, and that these people weren't Black. They were Hispanic and white. And it's like a weird thing happening, I thought. And, I called it out, and then another person called it out like immediately. But then what ended up happening with the broader group was like they were shocked that it was even like kind of called out. And I shared this. The reason I share this experience, Rachel, is because I want to bring it back to education. And I shared this with my kids because I was playing soccer and I was, I'm about to coach them. And I said, hey, this kind of rattled me. This happened. And the kids all sat there, looked at and heard the story, and they were like, oh, wow, Then my daughter grabbed me and she goes, the N-word's being said rampantly at my school. I'm like, what? And she said, yeah, oh yeah, like that's like a normal thing. And they kind of try to not say it around me, but I know they're saying it. And I was like, really? And apparently this is like a rampant thing because I knew it was happening in Madera Unified because it was being like brought up by Black students. But then for my daughter to share that with me, it hit me in a more real manner. And it was like, why aren't we being more honest about these types of things? Why aren't we sharing the elephants in the room? And and how does that impact my daughter's ability to learn? How does that impact other Black students' ability to
Mhm.
learn on campus? Do they really truly feel safe, right? Do they feel like they're welcome? Do they feel like a sense of true belonging when the N word is being rampantly stated? And I would just want to sit there with that about going back to your question about why getting naked. Right there is why we have to get naked in education, because we skip by these things as if it's not a big deal, and it really truly is, right? And it impacts in severe ways the educational abilities, in particularly of students in the margins that are feeling like no one cares about them.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I appreciate you bringing to this discussion continually is the story behind it, behind the why. And I want to one just kind of pause and maybe talk a little bit in a second about our conference, but before that, this is something that you've embraced and uphold and show leadership in, even within our company. Because I think it's one thing to say that this is important of educational leaders, but it's very different to say and embrace it yourself in the way that you're leading as CEO of our company. And I see that every day in your leadership. Do you want to talk about just a little bit practically what does that look like within Parsec and your kind of expectation of how that's lived out with our team when we talk about getting naked?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's tough because as a leader, you want to pretend you know it all and like have all the answers and it's always perfect. And it's like actually it's the opposite for me. I'm always fumbling through my words. I always like I feel like I make too many mistakes. But the one thing I try really hard to do is I try to be really honest with people with where things are at,
Mm-hmm.
where my head is. I try to be really intentional about the why behind things, and I try to own up to my own mistakes, right? And be honest about that. And one example was actually when with you, Rachel, when we were talking about our leadership team, and we were talking about bringing on a another person on the team, and then you had brought up that hey, like we were bringing on a lot of male on the team, and I initially inside me, I don't think it was very apparent to everyone on the call, but inside me, I was a little defensive. I was like, wait a minute. I'm trying to be intentional about like diversity and particularly women leadership. I'm like, just I'm all about that. And when you shared that initially inside, I was like, oh man, like I didn't see that. But that's exactly why it's so important for us to have be surrounded with leaders that come from different backgrounds and different perspectives and will share a different lens on things than having a vacuum of
Yeah.
people that just come from your walk of life and how you grew up and etc. And it's like holy moly, like, and that's exactly why I was like, oh man. And then I shared that with you, right, Rachel? I was like, thank you, right,
Yeah.
for sharing that, because we need to be intentional about how we recruit, and that starts with now how we like find people outside of just our small locus of circle. Like how do we broaden that and be intentional about hey, we want to bring in women leaders, not just for the sake of bringing on women leaders. It's because we're trying to radically transform education, and we need people from different backgrounds and perspectives, right, to be at the leadership table, right? And
That's right.
then so to connect that like to the summit in particularly, Rachel, it's is one of the non-negotiables we had in our summit, which was themed measure what we value, right? Is what did we do?
Yeah.
We highlighted and elevated student voice throughout the whole summit. And in
Yeah.
particularly, right, when you think about it being during February 1st, we highlighted Black student voices, which is like
Yeah.
probably unheard of. And not only did we So the other thing we did too, which is it wasn't just student performances. I've gone to a lot
That's
of
great.
conferences where students are performing, which is great. I think that's great. I'm not trying to say it isn't, but I rarely have been to a conference where students are keynoting or being the
Yeah.
feature of a panel discussion, right? So those are the types of things that, like, again, trying to model what we want to see within our organization. That's why our summit was focused on that. We really didn't have a lot of
Yeah.
Parsec services or products we were highlighting, to be honest with you. It was really about giving it. No, seriously, we didn't. Like, I think actually some
Yeah.
of our partners were a little bit, I wanted to see a little bit of Parsec.
You're right. Yeah. Yeah, and Babatunde, as we talk about the summit, I want to pause just for a second and come back to the story that you shared about bringing up our hires and ensuring that we're bringing on and starting to look for other women to serve on the leadership team. You know, and that's why I said the importance of the leader actually walking what they're talking about. And from my experience, and I've shared this with you, coming into this place, I heard you talk about that. And the reason I accepted the job at Parsec was when I came down for those few days, I watched that in action. I mean, even in just my visit, I saw it in action. And then not long after that, I watched you and Eugene, Parsec's founder, kind of go toe to toe over some things and it was a getting naked moment. It was you sharing how you felt. It was Eugene kind of pushing back. And I remember sitting there with like my eyes wide, like, uh-oh, like what's going to come out of this? And I think the amazing part for me that really resonated and clicked and then allowed me to be able to bring forward how like my thoughts in our meeting was you guys came to this place of, yeah, okay, I heard you and I appreciate your feedback. And I heard you and I appreciate your feedback. And maybe at times we don't see eye to eye, but I still care about you and appreciate your lens. And we're going to walk forward together. And that is just so clear. I think in every discussion we have at Parsec is we don't have to come to the same conclusion, but we're in this together and we're going to continue to walk forward together because that means more than being right, which I
Yeah.
really have to give you kudos, Babatunde, because it's your leadership that has set that precedent with our team and organization. And I see that same determination in the summit. So for people who are listening, Parsec just had their very first summit. It was a wild success. We had 150 of our partners that were there and engaged and listening. And I want to come back to this place because I think it connects to the story that you just talked about of we have to address the elephant in the room. Like you created a getting naked moment for everyone in that space because you put students at the center. And can you just share a little bit, especially about that first student panel? Some of the things that we heard in the space that you created that allowed these stories to be shared?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, so in preparation for the summit, I told the students, and then Angie Barfield, Dr. Barfield is amazing. She has worked with Black students up and down the state of California, but in particularly in Central Valley. And I knew of her work because when I was at Madera Unified, we engaged with her to support us with really elevating student voices in Madera. And as we were prepping, I worked with Angie Barfield in particularly to connect with students in Central Valley. And I said, hey, like, what I want to do is I want to elevate student voices, and particularly Black student voices in our summit. And I want us to kick off the summit with an all Black student panel. And I knew that, and I told her this. I said that the way I want us to let the students know about like what we're going to be talking about is I want them to be real about things. I want them to feel
Yeah.
free to share honestly and transparently about their experiences in our school systems. And I told Dr. Barfield that I don't think we've ever created like experience surrounded in a conference setting where adults in the system, educational leaders in the system, are coming to a summit to listen to Black student voices. This will be the first time
Yeah.
ever. And if there is one, great. I want to encourage more of that. And I knew this would be different. The thing that was challenging was to get the students to feel like people actually cared about what they had to say. And I told them I believe they do care. It's hard to believe it sometimes, but I told them, I said, I believe the adults in the system do want to hear what they have to say. They don't recognize what's really truly happening. And and I think that this experience is going to change them. I think they're going to really respect what you're
Mhm.
saying, empathize, and then hopefully it'll help them figure out ways to create better systems within their school systems. So the students were basically hoping that people would listen, and they came ready to share. And I think that during the experience, I mean, if you were there, you know what was shared. I mean, there was tears, in the audience, tears by the
Yeah.
students, right? One of the students shared a story that I'll never forget. And she shared a story where basically she had a favorite student, I'm sorry, a favorite teacher in her high school. And she decided to wear her hair in a fro. Normally, apparently, she wore it maybe in braids or maybe she straightened it, but she decided to wear it more naturally in a fro. And she came to school, and her favorite teacher said, "Oh, I didn't know it was crazy hair day," to her. And so you could just
Yeah.
imagine like how she felt in that moment. And the teacher had no clue, just no clue that like she thought it was just like if you look at both
Yeah.
perspectives, right? One person is extremely hurt by this. The other
Yeah.
person has no clue they just hurt you. No clue.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that we have to learn and realize in education is that the perspectives, the different places people are coming from are wildly different. And while that teacher didn't mean to do that, completely didn't mean to do that, that greatly impacted the ability for that student to learn in that moment. And so I think
Yeah.
that story, and there was other stories that were shared, but that one in particularly like hit me because, you know, I have my son and two daughters, and I could see that potentially even happening with my own kids in the system. And it's hard because as a parent, now wearing my parent hat, how do I help my child navigate that? And so could you imagine if our
Yeah.
teachers took seriously those things like the cultural trainings and the professional development and really just getting to know their students in their classes, right? That first week of school when you're
Yeah.
getting to know your students in the class, could that have been prevented potentially, right? But it
Yeah.
happened, and it's scarring, right? And now she feels like she's less than. She feels like she can't be her full true self because of that, her literally her favorite teacher saying that to her, right? And I think that I
Yeah.
just give that as an
Yeah.
example. And when we talk about measuring what we value, right? There's a story I share sometimes when we do our data capacity building session, Rachel. And I have a picture I show of a class, and it's a class of students and a teacher. And the teacher is a black male teacher teaching a kindergarten class in New York City. Well, that kindergarten class just happened to be
Hmm.
my kindergarten class. And I always share this with people because when I think about measuring what we value, the things that his name is Mr. Smith, that was my kindergarten teacher, that instilled in our class was things like self-worth, right? Things like a sense of
Yeah.
belonging, right? I was an English learner in that class, by the way. He treated me with such honor and dignity and respect. And not just me, all the other students in that class, by the way. He
Yeah.
built true relational capital with me, right? If you read Shane Saphir's book, Listening Leader, she describes that in detail. And that's what he was doing in that class with me and with the other students. And he made a transformative impact in my life. To this day, I remember his class, and that was kindergarten. I don't really
That's
remember
right.
my first grade class as much as kindergarten, right? And yeah, it was helpful for me to see a black male teacher. Not in kindergarten, I didn't realize that as a kid, but reflecting back, that was hugely impactful for me in my life and my career. So I just want to share that, like, that's the power of student voices, right? And so, Rachel, do you remember? I'm going to ask you a question. I know it's supposed to be me, but I'm going to flip it. Do you remember what the kids stated?
I should have expected this.
Do, do you remember what the students stated? All of them kind of stated as a theme, as what's one thing that would be a big thing that could impact K-12 education in a positive manner. Do you remember what they said?
No.
They all said it. So they all said having more black educators.
Yeah,
They
that's right.
intentionally said that. And it
Yeah.
goes back to that intentionality, right, Rachel? Like me, like I didn't see like, hey, we have to have female leadership in our highest level of leadership at Parsec Education. We have to be cognizant of that as we're growing and then we recruit. The same thing has to be done in education. And not just, by the way, it's not just for the black students. Everyone thinks, oh, it's just for the black students. No, no, it's not just for the black students. It's for the white students. It's for the Hispanic students. It's for the Asian students in the classroom, right? It's for the other students to see that black teachers, black leaders in education exist and they have value and they are highly skilled and can educate you in the highest levels. It's for all the
Yep.
students to see that. That's the thing that
Yeah.
people don't get sometimes. It's for all the
Yep.
students to see it.
I think exactly for what you said, because it's not just for the Black students, it's for all of us to change that
Exactly.
perception of who's engaged, who's participating, the leaders that we have within our society, and why that's so important. I think it's something that we don't reframe enough in our conversations, and it does a disservice. As we heard from the kids, the other thing that they kept coming back to was that one of the young women said, I want you to know, teacher, that I'm here and I'm here to be excellent. And it was just this, powerful moment for her to say,
Yes.
see me. I want you to see me. And that's what I feel like those kids were saying. And all kids say to a certain extent, I want to be
Mm,
seen and know that I'm seen within the classroom.
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That was a
Yeah.
beautiful moment.
Yeah, it was. We didn't get to any of our 4 questions, but I do want to just end with the same question that I've asked everyone, because I am curious to hear how you would respond to this, Babatunde. But what question in education are we not asking right now that we should be?
Oh, that's an easy one. That's an easy one. Are we measuring what we value? No, really. Are we truly measuring what
I
we
should have
value?
guessed that you would say that.
Or are we trying to value what we measure? So, no, no, seriously, the reason I say that is that what gets measured gets done, right? And so what
That's
we've
right.
relied
Yep.
on in education is insufficient instruments to truly measure what we value. And so, if we just stop at solely like our insufficient instruments, right? And we don't and the beauty of it right now, Rachel, is with this proliferation of technology, especially in the generative AI space, we can start to do things like potentially, at scale, do things like performance assessments, which, by the way, performance assessments, re, when created correctly, can reduce greatly bias in tests, right? Like, so, we can get into all kinds of things about standardized tests and the biases built into them, but performance assessments, when done correctly, can actually be a great way to getting to measuring what we value. And as like employers, right? Like I always joke around and I say like, I never asked, like, I didn't ask you, Rachel, like, what was your, test score in high school? It's like
I'm
ridiculous.
really glad we didn't.
But the reality is it's like, hey, like I asked you about like your leadership, right? Like some of
Yeah.
the big impact you've made across the state, et cetera, like the projects you've led, like that's what I'm asking you about. It's really a different form of performance assessment. And that's what we really care more about anyways, but it's harder to measure at scale. It's very costly. So this is why we resort to just solely standardized tests, right? Because it helps to at scale at least assess things like English language arts and mathematics and maybe science and maybe other areas potentially, right? The AP exams do the same thing with College Board. However, I am excited about what Carnegie Foundation is doing with, that's why we had like Diego Arambula. Um, Jorge
Yeah.
Aguilar was a panelist as well. He sits on the board for Carnegie as well. But I did, I think the collaboration with ETS, that's kind of exciting to see what happens there. But the reality is like, are we truly measuring what we value? And like, if we can answer that question and then put resources into doing that, I actually think it can drive the right policies, the right budgets, the right decisions downstream to transform education in especially in the United States.
I love that. I'm going to wrap us up on that note. My guest today has been Babatunde Ilori, Chief Executive Officer of Parsec Education. Thank you, Babatunde, for joining me today on the Getting Naked with Leaders in Education podcast.